Hello everybody, Raven Knight here. Today I have an interesting treat for you. As you know, I'm a historian, and I find a great amount of enjoyment in studying historical warriors, cultures, and groups. That's after all part of the reason I love For Honor. In fact, you may recall that one of the first response videos I ever did on this channel was a response video to Loxton and Noggin's video about the Knights, Vikings, and Samurai and who would win in a fight between them. Now, that video was abhorrent and deserved a good thrashing, but with that said, I find the idea of comparing and contrasting historical warriors a fascinating and enjoyable thing to do. And today, we're looking at another video doing just that. It seems that the YouTube channel DanCo has created a recent video about who would win, Knights or Samurai. Now, I should start by saying I know nothing about DanCo, so I can't say anything about their channel or what kind of videos they put out. But what I can talk about here is the concept of Knights versus Samurai as an idea, as a principle. There's a lot to compare and contrast between these two warriors. They have so much in common, but also so much different, that the manner in which you can compare these two is almost endless. Their armor styles, the weapon evolution, their outlooks on culture, religion, honor, and duty, their government makeup, their views on marriage, child raising, training, warfare, their battle tactics, their views on life and death in general. All of this is so fascinating to learn and understand, it could be an endless and wonderful conversation. But sadly, this usually isn't what happens. Usually what happens is you end up with a heated debate between two extremes to talk about who would obviously win if these warriors fought. On the one side, you got the weebs, who worship everything anime and Japanese, who say that samurai are god-tier warriors whose katana could cut through diamonds and therefore could easily penetrate the weak tin armor of a bunch of overweighted bucketheads whose only true claim to fame was genociding the Middle East. No. Really, I've heard that argument from those people. And then in the other camp, we hear the contrarians, who say the samurai are backward savages with wooden armor and swords so useless they'd snap in half if hit by a stiff breeze, whereas the knights are the epitome of chivalry, honor, and devotion to the great Deus Vult mantra, and would never lose to a bunch of overzealous Bushido bullshitters. Again, I've actually heard that argument for real. Both camps are highly in the wrong. And honestly, I've grown so weary of hearing these two sides rail at each other that I almost dread to speak out against them anymore. But does DanCo do a good enough job? Do they actually present both the Knights and Samurai in an even and equal light? Let's find out. Now, normally when I do these response videos, I like to use a different avatar, so let's see what I got. I got it. Samurai Claire. I don't use her very often, but she looks cool, right? I think that'll fit. Okay, let's do this thing.
Today we're taking a look at two of the most skilled, deadliest warriors in history, a knight versus a samurai. To see who'd win in a fight to the death, we're going to take a look at their weapons, their skills, their armor, all that to find out who ultimately comes out on top. So let's get to it. Now starting out, it's kinda hard to determine who the typical knight or typical samurai really was. It's not as simple as doing a fight like Superman versus Hulk. These warriors were around for centuries. Both Japan and Europe went through plenty of different iterations, from their training, to their armor, to their weapons. So just to keep things simple, samurai will be using a katana, will be wearing the most common armor, while the knight will be wearing plate armor. We'll take a look at two different options, a sword and a shield, and the two-handed great sword.
Okay, and we're already starting off pretty badly. Alright, so first of all, yes, this isn't the same as discussing specific characters like the Hulk or Superman, but we can still negotiate both warriors to a certain criteria. Usually what you want to do is start by looking at the heroes either at around the time period both were active, or you want to discuss both warriors when they were at their peak in technology, armor, and weaponry. Usually, to keep things fair, you go with the latter. Now, you start off this video by saying you'll give the samurai their katana and their most common armor. But that's far too vague a criteria. What is most common? What era are we talking about in samurai history? Are we talking about the box-shaped Oyuroi armor of the Heian period, which would have been the most common of that era? Perhaps you're talking about the haramaki, which was more for foot soldiers rather than mounted archers, brought about in the Kamakura period. Or, more likely, I assume you're probably talking about Gusoku armor, which was developed in the 16th century. In fact, with the addition of firearms, Tamashi Gusoku was developed, which was bullet-tested. So, yes, you have bullet-resistant armor at some point in Japanese history. So, which armor are you referring to when you say most common? Most common to who? What era was it common in? See, this is too vague, and it leaves way too much wiggle room for you to get out of whatever spots you may find yourself stuck in. And then you also say that you're only giving the samurai their katana. Okay, I hate this. I really hate that everyone I've looked at has done this. It's as if people think that the katana was the only weapon samurai carried. The katana was, essentially, a sidearm. A fallback weapon in the event that a polearm or spear is lost or broken. You have more options. You have the Yari spear, the Naginata polearm, the Nodachi longsword, the Kanabo club, Ono axe, other weapons like these. Now, granted, not all of these would be standard issue, but at the very least, giving them some kind of polearm would be the standard. Now, here's the thing. Let me say this. The katana is still a decent sword, and I wouldn't mind you just giving the samurai his katana alone, except, as you just said, you're giving the knights not only a sword and shield combo, but also their longsword. You've permitted the knights access to 2 different weapon sets and limited the samurai to only one. Their katana, their sidearm. This is already maddeningly unfair. Now, leaving that aside, let's look at the knights. So you say great sword, but you probably mean long sword. Those are 2 different things. Please don't get them confused. You also give them access to plate mail. I imagine you mean full plate mail when you say that, and I find that hilarious because, again, you don't specify the type of plate mail. But you know what? I'll excuse that. Most people just use plate mail as an encompassing term for the best armor from the 15th century through the 17th century. But here's the thing. You have to remember that not all soldiers could afford full plate mail. Mail of that quality is expensive, and not all knights could have access to a full set. But I already hear what you're going to say. We're talking about a knight who could have the best. We want to give the knights the absolute best they can get, right? Sure, all right. I will give you that. The knights deserve the best. We are talking about these warriors where they're at their best, right? For sure, I get that. Then why on earth are you limiting the samurai to just what's common? Why not give them their best? Give the samurai Nanban Gusoku at least, bro. If your whole argument is we just want to give these warriors their best to make a fair comparison, fine. Why did you say the samurai only get their common armor? Why are you only giving them their katana? See, this already feels very unfair. You're giving the knights the absolute best and limiting the samurai. This is feeling like Loxton and Noggin all over again. Now, moving on from that, another question I'd like to ask is this. Why do you give the knight a sword and shield if they're already wearing plate mail? See, the advent of plate mail armor changed the nature of weapon use in Europe. Polearms became far more favored, so a longsword makes sense, or maybe a halberd or a poleaxe of some kind. Why? Because once you had full plate mail armor, shields weren't as necessary. If the knight is using shields, odds are good they're compensating for armor disparity. You see a lot more shields when there wasn't much full plate armor, back when it was just chainmail or gambeson or hauberk. But you know what? Whatever. I've been on this too long. Let's keep going. You're starting off very unfair, but maybe you'll fix it as you go through. Let's keep going.
So let's start by taking a look at the samurai. So the earliest samurai started out in a form of ritualized warfare, where individual champions would have duels separate from the battlefield. But it gradually transitioned to more archery on horseback. That's what samurai actually became more known for in feudalistic Japan.
Alright, well, you're not entirely wrong there. During the Nara period, there was the practice of ikuichi, which means one-on-one combat. And essentially what this was at the beginning of battle, it was a ritualistic style of combat where warriors would rush out and find worthy rivals to battle, and as time passed, the armies would begin their own attack. However, this didn't last long into the Sengoku period. Now, I'll let this part slide because he's not technically wrong, but what I do take issue with is that you say this style of fighting evolved into horse archery, which is what samurai were most known for. Okay, while the samurai were known for being horsebound archers, which is true, this certainly wasn't all they were known for or all they were capable of. And besides, when talking about the ritualistic battle of the Japanese, it was not always or even often the outcome or incident that this happened. You had a lot of night raids, a lot of surprise attacks, underhanded tactics, sabotage, and other such things that took place. The idyllic outcome of ritualistic warfare was not the norm. There were plenty of dishonorable tactics in Japanese warfare, so this idea that the ritualistic way of combat was the only way or the common way is just not true.
Well, that and the samurai code. A code of honor, of discipline, of acceptance of death that almost gave the samurai this feeling of invincibility. They were warriors through and through. And like any good warrior, they had to have a sword. And for the samurai, it was the legendary katana. And as a sword, well, the katana is unmatched in sharpness and cutting power, perfectly designed to slash through flesh and bone with its razor-sharp edge. Yet, it was also great for thrusting and stabbing. It could be used one-handed or two-handed. It was able to fight on foot or horseback, armored or unarmored. It was meant to be wielded with quick, flowing movements, slicing and slashing at opponents.
The katana is the famous sword of the samurai because, during the Edo period, it was required that all samurai carry one as a badge of their status, and only samurai were allowed to carry them. However, in warfare, the katana was a backup weapon. While the katana excelled at slashing, it was not as adequate for thrusting and stabbing, though it certainly could. Now, you say that the katana could be used one-handed or two-handed? The katana is a two-handed weapon. Why would you use it one-handed when you get more out of it from two hands? I mean, what are you carrying in your other hand that would force you to use the katana one-handed? Besides, if you wanted to use a one-handed sword, the wakizashi was certainly acceptable. Now, as for doing it from horseback, we have no historical references telling us the katana was used on horseback. Obviously, if needs must, like if you're on a horse and you lose your spear, I guess you'll have to fall back on that, but that wasn't ideal. In truth, it was wiser to use a spear or pole-arm from horseback if you could. Please, I'm begging you, man, don't oversell the katana too much as so many do. It's a nice sword. It's a great sword, I would say. See the pun there? It's a really good sword, but it's not the end-all to beat-all.
So really a great, well-rounded design, but it's not like the ultimate perfect sword that can just cut through anything like a lightsaber. In fact, the katana actually has some downsides, especially when going up against a knight's broadsword and heavy-plated armor.
And the impartiality has been lost. Like, dude, you aren't even halfway through your video and you've revealed your conclusion already. Okay. You cannot discuss the katana in comparison to the longsword until you have discussed the strengths and weaknesses of that sword as well. Then, after you've talked about both longsword and katana, you can start comparing and contrasting. Doing this so soon gives away your end conclusion early without giving the samurai a fair shot. Like, think of it this way. If when talking about the drawbacks of the katana, you cannot do so without bringing up the longsword's superior qualities, perhaps you need to save that for the end of the video when doing the final compare and contrast. Look, we've already seen, even before the end of the video, who you think is going to win. So I don't even see the point of going on, but we will.
See, the katana is made for slashing and fighting against unarmored opponents. So the blade is incredibly hard, which makes it so exceptionally sharp, but it also makes it very brittle as well. It wasn't as flexible or tough as other swords were, which made it prone to bend or break. It wasn't really designed to take a whole lot of punishment.
All right, I want to put this to bed right now. I hear this a lot. I heard this in Loxton and Noggin's video. I hear this in a lot of people's videos. I want to put this to bed. This whole idea that the samurai sword, the katana, was just this brittle piece of crap that would break on impact with the enemy just way too easily. All right, we're gonna put this to bed. Allow me to quote sword expert John Clements. Quote, "A blade needs strength to resist deformation, but toughness to withstand cracking and chipping. A more pliable blade would have little strength, as it would deform too easily, but an overly hard blade, while having great strength to resist deformation, would also have no give. Rather than bend or stretch under stress, it would fracture to the point of snapping. An ideal cutting and thrusting sword blade is therefore between these two extremes." End quote. So, the katana itself definitely leans more on the harder side of the spectrum and was more brittle. And this means that yes, the katana could cut through softer objects with little issue and could maintain a sharp edge far easier and longer. But the contrast is that it was a bit more brittle and the spine was prone to bending. This is the result of the heat treatment applied to the katana in its forging and the limitations of the forges of Japan at the time. So yes, in terms of basic durability, it would seem that the katanas have an intrinsic disadvantage. However, notice that however there. To also quote John Clements later in his article, quote, "While the durability factor is one that should be the easiest to determine categorically by empirical measurement, it is one that has the least information on which to draw firm conclusions. No practical tests have ever been done to record the overall comparative attributes, being impact, fortness, and hardness, of the different respective blades from either culture, making generalized estimates thus difficult. Modern replica swords are typically poor substitutes for the real historical specimens, and anecdotal accounts of blade resilience or flexibility are not enough to go on, end quote. So, it would be absolutely foolish to dismiss durability as a factor. However, it would be inappropriate to assume that a katana would simply shatter or become useless simply because it was being brought against an enemy using hard armor or weapons. Bear in mind that the katana was not just used against soft targets, but against other samurai who also had armor and who also had metal weapons of their own. So even if not quite as durable in the sense a longsword was, to dismiss it entirely because it's a little bit more brittle is inappropriate. Also, bear in mind, I'm not just going after DanCo when I say all this. I'm saying this to all of those idiots out there who just assume, katana brittle, therefore bad sword, it's garbage, no good, only anime fans like. Get that crap out of here. That's a ludicrous conclusion to come to, and is founded almost purely on contrarianism. The katana certainly isn't a lightsaber that can cut through anything, and I'm not saying it is, but it's also not a brittle hunk of metal destined to break on contact with a stiff breeze, okay? They designed the sword to work well for what it needed to do, and that was slash at the enemy. It would not break just on first contact with enemy arms and armor. Let's be real, okay? Let's move on. Tired of that discussion.
And as for their armor, well, the samurai would wear an armor made up of lots of small iron or even leather scales, which were all connected together by leather braids or even set in these armor plates.
What the hell? Did you cut yourself off? Listen to that again.
Their braids or even set in these armor.
Were you about to say silk but cut yourself off there?
Their braids or even set in these armor.
Editing, dude. Come on.
Were usually attached to cloth or leather, and that's basically the armor. It was effective and durable, especially against the katana, but it was also meant to be as lightweight and flexible as possible, because the samurai had to do a lot of different things on top of swordsmanship, like archery or riding a horse. And because of that, you get a strong enough attack, and the armor could be penetrated, or the scales of the armor could simply just be knocked off. And all that leads us to the knight. And
again, this is so disingenuous. The armor you showed at the start there is kiko and has chainmail that is woven into a cloth backing. You don't mention the chainmail there, you completely ignore it. That armor is known as tatami gusoku armor, a form of folding armor given primarily to the Ashigaru soldiers. You also have various other armor styles to look at, like Tosei do Gusoku, which was made from metal plates and not scales. You completely dismiss all the individual components of the armor that made it such a strong defensive suit, and here's the best part, your editing blunder earlier that I point out, if you listen to the end of it, you show you were aware there were armor plates back then, but you just dismiss it. Here, listen.
Their braids or even set in these armor plates were usually attached to armor plates.
See? He pointed out there was plate mail. Now, you then say that if the attack is strong enough, it could just go through the armor. Friend, again, there were forms of armor that were bullet resistant. And as for needing to do a lot of things in armor, are you aware that there are various kinds of armor and samurai may own multiple sets? This feels like you merely looked at pop culture or anime and just drew your conclusions from it after confirming a few things with a fast Wikipedia search. Please, dude, you gotta do better than this.
His armor and his sword. And for the medieval knight, well, his chainmail and plate mail was all designed to deflect sword strikes and absorb hard-hitting blunt force attacks. Basically, the knight's armor was designed to defend against swords and bladed weapons, while the samurai's armor was actually more designed to defend against arrows and spears. And so there's really no comparison.
Arrows and spears. You treat that like it's nothing. Okay, if the samurai armor could stop a thrusting spear point, don't you think that's sufficient enough to block a slash too? Dude, you can't be serious right now. Do you think a spear strike is lesser than a sword strike? The knight armor could stop arrows and spears as well, you know. And the samurai armor was more than capable of blocking a sword strike. Here, you know what? I'm going to ask you something. I know this is going to be hard, bro, but I'm going to ask you to please use your brain for just a moment. Please unlock your mental capacity to think about this for a moment. Okay. If the samurai use swords like the katana, right? We agree that they use the katana? Okay. Don't you think it makes sense, therefore, that the samurai would make armor to defend against swords like the katana? Doesn't that make sense? You think that makes sense? That if they are aware that the katana is a sword they may have to go up against, they may want armor that protects against it, right? We can agree on that? Okay. So if the katana is used primarily for slashing, again, as you said it was, a good slashing weapon, don't you think, therefore, the armor they make to counter it should be maybe good at blocking slashing attacks? I mean, to me, that would just track. That would make a lot of sense, you know? Your enemy may have a sword that specializes in slashing. Well, maybe our armor should be good at stopping slash attacks, right? Doesn't that make sense to you? That makes plenty of sense to me. Maybe I'm the crazy one. I don't know. Maybe I'm the crazy one. Moving on.
A full suit of plate armor was renowned for its strength, was nearly resistant to all sword attacks, and actually required entirely different specialized weapons in order to defeat it. Either that or knights would actually just end up wrestling on the ground.
Okay, you know what? Fire your editor, dude. Your background footage here that you're using doesn't connect at all to what you're talking about. You use samurai footage while talking about the knights, and you use Viking footage from For Honor while talking about knight armors and weapons. This is piss poor editing right here, bro. Sorry, I was distracted. What were you saying again? About how plate mail armor could block almost any sword strike? Well, yeah. That's why pole arms became so popular after the introduction of full plate mail armor, because they had the potential to cause bludgeoning damage, and a knight could get a great deal of power in a two-handed strike to get through armor. But anyway, continue, please.
And trying to stab their swords or daggers into any gaps in the armor, rather than, actually sword fight. But while the samurai likely would have a deadly dagger and some skill with grappling like that, he would still have a really tough time facing off against and defeating any type of plate armor.
Okay, this is completely dismissive. I want you to consider all that you just said, bro. You point out that quite often knights would end up on the ground grappling, trying to slide daggers into weak spots in armor, or between individual plates, which is certainly true, but then you act like the samurai were just incapable of this? I mean, look back, you say this.
But while the samurai likely would have a deadly dagger and some skill with grappling like that.
Now, first of all, you are aware that the samurai practiced jujitsu, right? They were more than capable of grappling and striking with tanto daggers and doing the exact same thing as knights. In fact, they did. This was common samurai fighting tactics. But let's pretend that that's not the case. Okay, let's pretend for a moment that's not the case. Okay. You follow up that point, that the samurai could try to do the same thing, but then simply say they'd still have a hard time against plate mail. Well, yeah, but that's why they do the grapple thing that you said they could do. You know what? Let's play a game. I'm going to play a little hypothetical. A samurai and a knight are fighting, and the samurai manages to knock the knight to the ground, pulls a dagger, and tries to slide it through a gap in the armpit. All right? Tell me, what difficulty would the samurai run into at this point that a knight would not? Why couldn't a samurai who managed to get into the grapple be unable to stab a knight through the armor gaps? Why couldn't a samurai do that? You have blatantly dismissed the samurai's years of battlefield experience, their training, and capability. Even when you present the idea that they could exploit a weakness that other knights make use of, you act as if they would have more difficulty without any reasoning. This is painful, man. This is actually painful. You could talk about how both warriors would practice this, where they bring their enemy to the ground and try to take advantage of gaps in the armor by stabbing with a knife, because samurai did that. Knights did that. This is a similarity they have. And you could talk about the differences in the knives, like the difference between a knight dagger and a samurai tanto. You could talk about those differences, but you don't. You simply say, well, the knights sometimes do this, but the samurai would still have trouble doing it. Why? Why couldn't they do it? I feel like you didn't do any research on this.
In fact, the armor might actually just end up damaging that fine razor-sharp edge from the katana, leaving the samurai kinda screwed.
Ugh. Yeah, you're right, they're screwed, because the katana is the only weapon they had. No other existed. The samurai just didn't own any other weapons. Not the nodachi, not the naginata, not the kanabo, not the kama, not the yari, not the kusarigama, not the odachi, not the yumi. Nope. No, none of those things are real. All figments of my effing imagination, right? Yep, none of that existed. Ugh.
And then, of course, there's the knight's weapon of choice, a sword, or really two different variations, a shorter sword and shield, or a two-handed great sword. Now, there's a reason why virtually every culture around the world developed some sort of rendition of a sword and shield, because it is extremely, extremely effective. A sword and shield is much better than a sword on its own. as the shield gives the knight a super strong defense that actually limits the samurai because he can only really attack the non-shield side, all while the knight doesn't really have to worry about that because his sword can cut from almost any angle around or underneath the shield.
I said it before and I'll say it again. The knight shield faded out of use as plate mail became more prominent. That's because plate mail came to replace the typical shield in terms of necessity. There is no need for a shield to tie up one of your arms when you have a perfectly capable suit of armor. Since you're discussing the knights having full plate mail in this battle, they should probably not have a shield here ideally. And as for only attacking the non-shield side, you are aware. A shield can be moved around the body as necessary by moving an arm to either side, right? The arm is capable of moving the shield to whatever side they need to. So even if you do give the knight their shield, they still have a pretty all-encompassing defense. And I'm kind of wondering if you just thought this was a D&D discussion here.
Plus, the shield itself can be used offensively too. And while the katana is a strong, effective sword, you can't actually expect it to beat a shield or simply just cut it in half or something like that. No way. In fact, because of how medieval shields were built, it's actually more likely that an opponent's sword would simply get stuck in the wood of the shield rather than actually cutting right through it. And while samurai were incredibly skilled warriors, from what we know, they really didn't have much experience going up against opponents with shields.
I'd like to take this moment to point out that you're showing footage of two samurai reenactors fighting with spears, a weapon you refuse to even consider giving the samurai. I can't help but laugh at this, really. This is blatant. Like, your own visual contradicts your setup. Again, your editing is piss poor, especially for what you're trying to say here.
And because of just the incredible effectiveness and formidability that a shield gives the knight, well, it would be a lot for the samurai to overcome. And as for the knight's short sword, well, it was specifically designed to be used alongside a shield. It was perfect for cutting through armor and deep into an opponent with quick, forceful attacks.
Perfectly designed for cutting through armor. Bro, you just said earlier how plate mail armor was resistant to slashing attacks, and now you're saying that their arming sword is perfectly designed to cut through armor. Is this like the riddle about the unstoppable force meeting an immovable object? If a perfect cutting sword meets an uncuttable armor, which one wins? Who the hell knows? This guy certainly doesn't, because he'll just say what he needs to, it seems, to get his point across. This is contradictory language. You cannot say on the one hand their armor was uncuttable, but then say that their sword was designed to cut through armor. Which is it?
They were also designed to be both light and agile, at the same time tough and flexible enough to withstand battle. Basically, that sword isn't going to have really any problem cutting through a samurai's armor, because a samurai's armor isn't anything it hasn't seen before.
You are so disingenuous towards this freaking matchup. You dismiss the durability of samurai armor entirely without even discussing or exploring any other forms of it. You say it's nothing that the knights haven't seen before? Yeah, but that doesn't mean a sword can just easily cut through it. Even if the armor is something they're familiar with, or it's made in a manner that they can recognize, that does not mean that they won't have any issue dealing with it. Look, it's like a knight going up against another knight and going, plate mail armor, I've seen this before, doesn't change the difficulty of getting through it. I have no word for this dishonesty. This is incredibly dishonest and disingenuous.
And then there's the other option here, the knight's great sword. And funny enough, for as amazing as the katana is and how much it's hyped up to be, the great sword or long sword is arguably an even more complex weapon. See, it has two edges that can be used as opposed to just one. It has a crossguard that gives the sword a lot of versatility and allows the knight to use a lot of different fighting techniques. And the sword can even be used like a half sword. Basically, the knight literally grips the sword around the blade itself and treats it like a short spear, which is really effective when fighting against armor. Basically, while sometimes a knight's sword is just described as a hunk of iron or just a bat or club with edges, while the samurai's sword is treated almost like a lightsaber that can cut through anything. That's just not the case. A knight's sword was exceptionally well made, lightweight, actually weighed roughly as much as a katana, and was perfectly suited for either dishing out dismembering cuts or stabbing deep into an opponent's body. It was definitely something to be feared and respected.
You know, I'm not going to restate that it's incredibly unfair that you gave the knights 2 sword variations while the samurai only gets 1, because I already said that earlier. But what I am going to say is that what you say about this in this portion of the video is just like Noggin's video, just like Loxton and Noggin. The bias and motivation is clear as day. What DanCo wants to do is fight the myth that the katana is a god-tier sword and redeem the view of the European longsword in the eyes of his audience. And granted, that's a noble pursuit, but just like Noggin, he has done this by completely undermining the samurai, dismissing all of their weapons aside from the katana, and being disingenuous about the katana anyway. I agree that the longsword is likely the superior sword overall due to versatility, thrusting capability, and overall range of use. But, need I remind you, this is not a video comparing the katana versus the longsword. This is supposed to be a video about the samurai versus the knight. How about we compare a knight's spear to a samurai yari, a longbow to a yumi, a naginata to a glaive, a kanabo to a halberd? There are lots of discussions to be had here, but your bias and goal here is now clear as day, and that's unfortunate. In fact, here's a question. You said you were going to talk about armor, weapons, and skills. Why not discuss their skills, training, styles of fighting, and battle tactics? What if the way that a samurai uses their sword or spear is very different from the way a knight uses their sword and spear? That may come into play. Look, I'm not saying your conclusion would be any less correct, but I'm saying your treatment of the samurai in this is so unfair.
So, who wins here? Well, it is tough to say, because again, we're dealing with historical warriors and not specific characters.
Oh, come on, dude. Are you really playing coy right now? After all you've said in this video, you still expect me to believe you think it's a tough call? You said the knight sword would have no problem going through samurai armor, that the katana would just break on a knight's armor, and that the shield would be unstoppable against a samurai katana. You made it very clear who you think would win. Don't go with this, oh, it's a tough call. Come on, you've already revealed who you think would win.
But I think the knight would win more often than not. You could argue that a samurai would be skilled enough, or just lucky enough, to stab through the gaps in the knight's armor, but that's just not likely to happen, especially because the knight's armor was significantly better than a samurai's. His strategy of fighting with sword and shield is very effective against the samurai just having a sword, and a great sword is just as effective and deadly, if not more so, than the katana.
Okay, I said I was done with it. I'm not done with it. Once again, you compare 2 sets of the knight against 1 weapon set of the samurai. I'm not saying you're wrong about the outcome, bro. I'm not saying you're wrong about it. I'm saying you walked into this match clearly with the odds stacked against the samurai from the start. Again, I agree the shield and sword of the knight gives a clear advantage, but with that sword and shield, you may not have a full suit of plate mail, if we're talking about historical accuracy, and you just can't bring yourself to deny the knights their armor therefore. But if you go with the long sword so that the knights can have their plate mail, then the samurai might find an opening to exploit, and that's, again, too much of a risk for you. You have to be sure that both weapon sets and tactics are available to the knight without being honest about the outcome and the odds. Let me be clear. If you were to put me into the octagon against a man with 4 arms, but still say that that's an impartial matchup, then you're obviously a liar. It's the same here. You're giving the knights an extra set of tools to win, whereas the samurai is stuck with 1.
The knight would win this fight. But what do y'all think? Sound off in the comments down below. Keep the debate going and let me know why you agree with me, or tell me why you think the samurai would take the victory. And be sure to hit that like button, the subscribe button, and I will see y'all next time.
Alright, we're going to wrap this up. To be fair, to be 100% fair, this video was not as bad as Matt Pat's or Loxton and Noggin's videos. They were far worse. But I wouldn't be so kind as to say that this video is innocent and passable. The production value, first of all, is pitiful. Constant clips and videos in the backdrop that did not at all go with the content being talked about, like samurai footage playing while talking about the knights, Viking footage playing interchangeably when they weren't even a talking point, and on and on. There were more than a few poor reads where it seems the narrator messed up a line or poorly cut off at certain points that revealed either that this was an AI narrated reader or a failed video to edit properly. Now, beyond the production value, I'll give DanCo credit that they didn't just outright dismiss the samurai as irrelevant like Noggin did, but they certainly didn't do them any real favors. The descriptions and diction they use sound like he's done very minimal research. While he praised the katana for being good at slashing, that was all he really gave to them. He barely explored their training, skills, or experience. He limited the samurai to only one weapon, which would have been fine if they'd done the same for the knight, but instead he gave the knight 2 different swords and a shield. This felt very inappropriate, and the samurai felt very shortchanged. Now, I want to make this very clear. In the discussion of samurai versus knights, or hell, any matchup of warrior versus warrior, it's incredibly hard to give a definitive, well, obviously this warrior wins, because there are various factors that come into play beyond just armor and weapons. Those are important, but so is training, overall health, battle experience, terrain, and X factors. For example, yes, I agree that the knight has better armor and swords generally, but if a samurai does grapple a knight to the ground somehow, a samurai is not unfamiliar with grappling, and they, of course, would have a knife to slide through the plate mail. Though a knight has the advantage of a shield, samurai also have access to matchlock rifles to provide firearm edges. And though the knight has training against armored warriors, so too do the samurai. Though the samurai sword is hard and can be damaged from constant use, it wouldn't break just from one battle. And besides, a knight's sword may come with its own drawbacks. After all, a sword that's too soft would deform easily. There are various factors that must be considered in discussions like this. Now, I will say that in the majority of cases, I do think the knights win this fight. They do have superior armor and weapons that give them a large edge, and they also have an arsenal of armor-countering polearms like halberds and billhooks that give them a definitive advantage against even the armored samurai. But I'm definitely not assuming the samurai don't stand a chance. Samurai are skilled and trained, they are a warrior caste, and they too would have tactics to deal with an armored foe. So I have to say that while this video was piss poor, the discussion, admittedly, is a very hard one to have anyway. But that doesn't excuse DanCo for doing what seems to be very minimal research, poor production value, and honestly just not being fair to either warrior. But I think that's where I'll end it for now. Thank you guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and as always, I will see you in my next video. Take care.